Hello there. I hope you're doing well. And welcome to the Reason RX podcast. So, today I would like to read, in whole or in part, the article, "The Median Isn't the Message," by Stephen Jay Gould, a famous evolutionary biologist. Good stuff, and we'll discuss it a little bit. But hope you're enjoying the episodes. And if you'd, like the show on the podcast app, leave a good comment, share them with others who want to learn and be rational, spread good ideas, make a better culture, live a better life for ourselves and our friends and families and those we love, make a better society and a better culture. And especially share with schools and teachers and administrators. Education's a basic, it's a fundamental, something we need to improve. As the commercial used to say, a mind is a terrible thing to waste. So let's not do it. Let's be good human, rational animals, self-sovereign social animals. All right. Now, first, in this article on Edward Tufte's website is where I'll read it from. I'll put a link to it so you could read along or read it later. It's good, something good to read over, share with others. It's in on many different sites, many different places. It's a very good, popular article, a classic. But on Edward Tufte's site, there's a preparatory note by Stephen Dunn. I'm not sure who Stephen Dunn is, but it gives you some background to this. Steve Dunn says, quote, "Stephen Jay Gould was an influential evolutionary biologist who taught at Harvard University. He was the author of at least 10 popular books on evolution and science, including, among others, The Flamingo's Smile, The Mismeasure of Man, Wonderful Life, and Full House. As far as I'm concerned, Gould's The Median Isn't the Message is the wisest, most humane thing ever written about cancer and statistics. It is the antidote both to those who say that the statistics don't matter and to those who have the unfortunate habit of pronouncing death sentences on patients who face a difficult prognosis. Anyone who researches the medical literature will confront the statistics for the disease. Anyone who reads this will be armed with reason and with hope. The median isn't the message is reproduced here by permission of the author," unquote. Now, Stephen Jay Gould had some... Switching my microphone here. Forgot to check that earlier. So I don't know if there's a difference in sound quality between then and now, but different microphone. Okay, so he had a cancer, and I think he discusses it in here. And so, postscript by Stephen Dunn. That's where some of this is, I think. Yeah, okay. So at the end of the article is a postscript, of course, but Steve Dunn says, quote, "Many people have written me to ask what became of Stephen Jay Gould. Sadly, Dr. Gould died in May of 2002 at the age of 60. Dr. Gould lived for 20 very productive years after his diagnosis, thus exceeding his 8-month median survival by a factor of 30. Although he did die of cancer, it apparently wasn't mesothelioma, but a second and unrelated cancer. In March 2002, Dr. Gould published his 1,342-page magnum opus, The Structure of Evolutionary Theory. It is fitting that Gould, one of the world's most prolific scientists and writers, was able to complete the definitive statement of his scientific work in philosophy just in time. That text is far too long and dense for almost any layman, but the works of Stephen Jay Gould will live on. Especially, I hope, the median isn't the message, period, unquote. Okay, so there's the cancer he had, 8-month median survival time. He didn't go for that, he lived longer. Okay, so there's some background. Now, in the article itself, the median isn't the message by Stephen Jay Gould. He writes, quote, "My life has recently intersected, in a most personal way, two of Mark Twain's most famous quips. One I shall defer to the end of this essay. The other, sometimes attributed to Disraeli, or however you pronounce his name, identifies three species of mendacity, each worse than the one before. Lies, damned lies, and statistics. Consider the standard example of stretching the truth with numbers, a case quite relevant to my story. Statistics recognizes different measures of an average or central tendency. The mean is our usual concept of an overall average. Add up the items and divide them by the number of sharers. 100 candy bars collected for 5 kids next Halloween will yield 20 for each in a just world. The median, a different measure of central tendency, is the halfway point. If I line up 5 kids by height, the median child is shorter than 2 and taller than the other 2. He might have trouble getting their mean share of the candy. A politician in power might say with pride, the mean income of our citizens is $15,000 per year. The leader of the opposition might retort, but half our citizens make less than $10,000 per year. Both are right, but neither cites a statistic with impassive objectivity. The first invokes a mean, the second a median. Means are higher than medians in such cases, because one millionaire may outweigh hundreds of poor people in setting a mean, but he can balance only one mendicant in calculating a median, unquote. Okay, so there's a beginning. Gould's talking about what a mean is and what a median, the usual idea of an average. Like, you can add up the weights of 5 dogs, divide by 5, and you get the mean, M-E-A-N. But if you put the weights in order from least to greatest, the one in the middle is the median. So there are different ways of getting a middle or an average. Now we got this set up in context of, as he says, Mark Twain's quotes. All right, so, quote, "The larger issue that creates a common distrust or contempt for statistics is more troubling," unquote. More troubling than, of course, some people misusing mean versus median, as he said earlier. Quote, "Many people make an unfortunate and invalid separation between heart and mind, or feeling and intellect. In some contemporary traditions, abetted by attitudes stereotypically centered on Southern California, feelings are exalted as more real and the only proper basis for action. If it feels good, do it. While intellect gets short shrift as a hang-up of outmoded elitism. Statistics in this absurd dichotomy often become the symbol of the enemy. As Hilaire Belloc wrote, statistics are the triumph of the quantitative method, and the quantitative method is the victory of sterility and death. Unquote Belloc. Quote Gould again. This is a personal story of statistics properly interpreted as profoundly nurturant and life-giving. I'll repeat that, so unquote. So quote again. This article is a personal story of statistics properly interpreted as profoundly nurturant and life-giving. It declares holy war on the downgrading of intellect by telling a small story about the utility of dry academic knowledge about science. Heart and head are focal points of one body, one personality, unquote. Excellent. Statistics and context. Look at the big picture. Connect, connect, connect. Philosophy matters. This should be in education, should be in school, should be how statistics is taught. It should be part of it. So passionately. Gould's got a passionate article here. Hell yeah. That's what we should do. We should be passionate about this stuff. Statistics isn't dry. If people think of it that way, boring, bad classes. Decreased teaching, decreased learning, decreased understanding of statistics. Okay. And we should have a certain view of humanity here too, not mind and body separate. Not, it should be like the rock band Rush said in their albums, one album, The Heart and Mind United in a single perfect sphere. Feeling and intellect together, heart and mind working together. Okay. Quote, in July 1982, I learned that I was suffering from abdominal mesothelioma, a rare and serious cancer usually associated with exposure to asbestos. When I revived after surgery, I asked my first question to my doctor and chemotherapist. What is the best technical literature about mesothelioma? Mesothelioma. I keep putting an IA at the end, sorry. But again, Gould says he asked his doctor and chemotherapist, what is the best technical literature about mesothelioma? She replied with a touch of diplomacy, the only departure she has ever made from direct frankness, that the medical literature contained nothing really worth reading. Of course, trying to keep an intellectual away from literature works about as well as recommending chastity to Homo sapiens, the sexiest primate of all. As soon as I could walk, I made a beeline for Harvard's Cantway Medical Library and punched mesothelioma into my computer's bibliographic search program. Unquote. And that was 1982, so that's pretty primitive computers, but they did have computers. Some of them back then in computer classes, you'd have like an Apple or a computer, and then you'd have like a cassette tape for the recording. Ha! Okay. Quote, an hour later, surrounded by the latest literature and on abdominal mesothelioma, I realized with a gulp why my doctor had offered that humane advice. The literature couldn't have been more brutally clear. Mesothelioma is incurable with a median mortality of only 8 months after discovery, unquote. So, of course, median, the middle. 50% are below 8 months, 50% above. That's the middle. Quote, I sat stunned for about 15 minutes, then smiled and said to myself, so that's why they didn't give me anything to read. Then my mind started to work again, thank goodness. If a little learning could ever be a dangerous thing, I had encountered a classic example. Attitude clearly matters in fighting cancer. We don't know why. From my old-style materialistic perspective, I suspect that mental states feed back upon the immune system. But match people with the same cancer for age, class, health, socioeconomic status, and, in general, those with positive attitudes, with a strong will and purpose for living, with commitment to struggle, with an active response to aiding their own treatment, and not just a passive acceptance of anything doctors say, they tend to live longer. Period. Amen. Okay, yes. Do not please passively accept anything any authority says. If people did that, then, for example, Gould would be gone earlier, or we would not have yet figured out how to fly a plane because the Wright brothers ignored what a world's leading expert said about how wind and wing interact, and they did not trust or believe this coefficient he had developed, and so did testing on their own to think independently and to find out what really mattered. They did not passively accept what this so-called world-leading expert said as everyone else was doing. No, they thought on their own. They committed to struggle. They had an active response in their own work. So that's another very important thing in this article. Independent thought. Process, process, process. Okay. Quote. A few months later, I asked Sir Peter Medawar, my personal scientific guru and a Nobelist in immunology, what the best prescription for success against cancer might be. A sanguine personality, he replied. Fortunately, since one can't reconstruct oneself at short notice and with a definite purpose, I am, if anything, even-tempered and confident in just this manner. Hence the dilemma for humane doctors. Since attitude matters so critically, should such a somber conclusion be advertised? Especially since few people have sufficient understanding of statistics to evaluate what the statements really mean? From years of experience with the small-scale evolution of Bahamian land snails treated quantitatively, I have developed this technical knowledge, and I am convinced that it played a major role in saving my life. Knowledge is power, in Bacon's proverb, unquote. Amen. Yes. Teachers should take that seriously. This article is something every statistics teacher should read and memorize and develop all the ideas of. Read over and over again. Like some people in the Old West, some cowboys, would have one book, but they would know it deeply because they would read it so much and think about it. Or Abraham Lincoln. You can read in Abraham Lincoln and the Structure of Reason. That's the name of the book. Maybe I'll put a link in the show notes if I recall. But I forgot the author's names right now. It's late. I'm tired. And so on. But they talk about how Abraham Lincoln didn't have many books, but he knew them well. Instead of reading shallowly a lot, as some do, some read less and read more deeply, and hence get much more out of it. Right. Knowledge is power. And as he says here, I'm convinced reasoning, science, understanding played a major role in saving my life. Okay. Quote, the problem may be briefly stated. What does median mortality of 8 months signify in our vernacular? I suspect that most people, without training in statistics, would read such a statement as, I will probably be dead in 8 months. The very conclusion that must be avoided, since it isn't so, and since attitude matters so much. I was not, of course, overjoyed, but I didn't read the statement in this vernacular way either. My technical training enjoined a different perspective on 8 months median mortality. The point is a subtle one, but profound, for it embodies the distinctive way of thinking in my own field of evolutionary biology and natural history, unquote. Amen. Now comes the big stuff. This is a great article. But, right, your philosophic perspective on thinking and math and statistics matters, and on science. It can make or break you, success or failure. It's not irrelevant. And attitude and thinking go together, as he said. Again, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of it quite like that before either, but we might think attitude and fall into this mind-body dichotomy thing. But remember, if you go back to what he said earlier, many people make an unfortunate and invalid separation between heart and mind, or feeling and intellect, unquote. So we can connect that with attitude matters. It's not pure feeling, just as he's saying here. So, he says attitude matters. He needs to be sanguine. Now, he says he had a different perspective than most people on 8 months median mortality. And he says it's a subtle point that he's talking about, this difference in perspective, but it's profound because it's philosophic. And he goes into that here. It's great. Quote, we still carry the historical baggage of a Platonic heritage that seeks sharp essences and definite boundaries. Thus we hope to find an unambiguous beginning of life or definition of death, although nature often comes to us as irreducible continua. Unquote. Okay, now, not quite right. the more important Platonic heritage is the separation of concepts from the evidence of the senses, kind of mind-body dichotomy as he's talking about earlier when Gould was saying mind versus body, feeling versus intellect, things like that. Instead of looking at us as one unified whole, we got these different aspects. Yes, obviously, there are emotions, just like there are fingers versus eyes, obviously, but they're connected. They're not this totally separate things as some people want to think, like 100% emotion or 100% reasoning. For example, if you know, as we grow up, we can see the same thing and we have a totally different emotional response to it because of what we learned. It's because of what we know. Emotions are in that context of knowledge and our connection to reality. We can't, and emotions are value responses. We can't value something until we know that it exists, what it is, and how it relates to us. There's a cognitive component, a conscious component that underlies emotions. But, and the thing here that's more important is this false Platonic idea that concepts are separate from perception, as I say. I'll discuss that a bit more later. That's part of the Platonic heritage that's going on here. And so that's why not so much the sharp essences too. Essences can be real, but they can be considered cognitive. It's when you look at when one tries to consider an essence as metaphysical instead of epistemological that there's problems. There are some definite boundaries we can draw, things like that, but not in a Platonic way. Got to do it rationally. With a good, more Aristotelian epistemology and metaphysics. Okay. So then, as he says, quote, this Platonic heritage, with its emphasis in clear distinctions and separated immutable entities, unquote. So immutable, like concepts that never change, instead of grasping the reality that Galileo and Aristotle and Newton knew, that concepts were unifications. They were awarenesses of individual things put together that are similar. You see a dog and a dog, so you can get a general idea of a dog. Whereas Plato didn't know. How the heck could these concepts, which are timeless and universal, come from something particular and temporary? I see a dog here and now. I never have this particular perception of this dog again. How do we get that? I don't get it. It can't happen. So instead of really figuring it out, I mean, it was a long time ago. So it's different than someone saying that nowadays. There's no excuse. But then people were starting to figure things out more, a little more excuse. But immutable, unchanging. So these concepts were unchanging, timeless, and universal. That's kind of what's going on here. That's like the Platonic heritage that he's talking about with worshiping a median or worshiping a mean. Okay. Quote, this Platonic heritage, with its emphasis in clear distinctions and separated immutable entities, leads us to view statistical measures of central tendency wrongly, indeed opposite to the appropriate interpretation in our actual world of variation, shadings, and continua. In short, we view means and medians as the hard realities, and the variation that permits their calculation as a set of transient and imperfect measurements of this hidden essence, unquote. So so people get carried away with the mean or median and regard those as something to be obeyed or followed or real, and the variation is considered less real. Whereas it's the opposite, as Aristotle pointed out. Individuals are real. Concepts are not real in the same way, as I'll give some quotes about later. So it's the variation, the individuals, the concrete things that are real, and only with those can we get the abstraction of mean or median. Mean and medians are abstractions. They are not the thing. A bunch of dogs are the thing. Their average is an abstraction. And I might say that, but then I could say that to some people and they think, yeah, I know. But they don't do that when they're thinking about statistics. They don't really understand. They don't know. Because if they knew it would be knowledge. It would be an awareness of their own knowledge. But it's just a word string they think it sounds right, so they agree with. They don't grasp that it's that statement that the dogs are the real thing and the average is an abstraction. They don't know that because that would be derived from examples of little individual things. Here's some people, and we get the average of these people in weight. Here's some birds, and we get the average of the birds from their weight. And they would, and then they would know that that's where the average comes from, and they would know that when they hear an average, to automatically demand a range and not stick with that. But notice a lot of people are happy with an average, a mean or median, and they don't see immediately what's the variation. That shows they don't understand. They don't know what this means. Like I say, if people did, then when they heard what's the mean, they go, no, what's the average? What's the standard? What's the, sorry, I'm a little tired. Okay, they wouldn't say, when they heard an average, a mean, they would say, what is the range? What is the IQR? And IQR is interquartile range. It's like the middle 50%. The range is, biggest minus smallest. They would want to know what's the standard deviation, things like that. What's a 5-number summary? And that 5-number summary is min, max, the median, and then halfway point in the lower half, halfway point in the upper half. So, you'd want to know where's the cutoff point for the bottom 25%, where's the cutoff point for the top 25%, things like that. Then you're starting to deal with the variation. Instead of taking the mean or median as all you need to know. It's not. That's kind of what's going on here. So I'll read that paragraph again and read the whole thing. So, and I'll start with the previous one. So, quote, I was not, of course, overjoyed, but I didn't read the statement in this vernacular way either. Well, I guess I got to do with the previous one. Okay, quote, the problem may be briefly stated. What does median mortality of 8 months signify in our vernacular? I suspect that most people, without training in statistics, would read such a statement as, I will probably be dead in 8 months. The very conclusion that must be avoided since it isn't so, and since attitude matters so much, unquote. Attitude, mind-body dichotomy, intellect and feeling, as you talked about earlier. Okay, quote, I was not, of course, overjoyed, but I didn't read the statement in this vernacular way either. My technical training enjoined a different perspective on 8 months median mortality. The point is a subtle one, but profound, for it embodies the distinctive way of thinking in my own field of evolutionary biology and natural history. We still carry the historical baggage of a Platonic heritage that seeks sharp essences and definite boundaries. Thus we hope to find an unambiguous beginning of life or definition of death, although nature often comes to us as irreducible continua. This Platonic heritage, with its emphasis in clear distinctions and separated immutable entities, leads us to view statistical measures of central tendency wrongly, indeed opposite to the appropriate interpretation in our actual world of variation, shadings, and continua. In short, we view means and medians as the hard realities, and the variation that permits their calculation as a set of transient and imperfect measurements of this hidden essence. If the median is the reality and variation around the median, just a device for its calculation, the I will probably be dead in 8 months may pass as a reasonable interpretation. But all evolutionary biologists know that variation itself is nature's only irreducible essence. Variation is the hard reality, not a set of imperfect measures for a central tendency. Means and medians are the abstractions. Therefore, I looked at the mesothelioma statistics quite differently. And not only because I am an optimist who tends to see the donut instead of the hole, but primarily because I know that variation itself is the reality. I had to place myself amidst the variation. Unquote. Yes. Be real, immerse ourselves in reality. Don't get lost in abstractions or floating abstractions. Awesome. So he's being Aristotelian here. Variation, in other words, individuals, concrete things, the whole population of something, that is the hard reality. Variation isn't merely a way to get some means of getting the real reality, the central tendency. No. Variation is the reality. Means and medians are the abstraction. They are less real, so to speak. Okay. Quote, when I learned about the 8-month median, my first intellectual reaction was, fine, half the people will live longer. Now, what are my chances of being in that half? I read for a furious and nervous hour and concluded with relief. Damn good. I possessed every one of the characteristics conferring a probability of longer life. I was younger. My disease had been recognized in a relatively early stage. I would receive the nation's best medical treatment. I had the world to live for. I knew how to read the data properly and not despair. Another technical point then added even more solace. I immediately recognized that the distribution of variation about the 8-month median would almost surely be what statisticians called right skewed. In a symmetrical distribution, the profile of variation to the left of the central tendency is a mirror image of the variation to the right. In skewed distributions, variation to one side of the central tendency is more stretched out, left skewed if extended to the left, right skewed if it stretched to the right, unquote. Okay, so a symmetrical is like a bell. Go down the center of the bell, you got a nice even thing on one side. It's like a reflection on one side or the other. Whereas, with skew, it's like having a tail that stretches out. So it might be like a long tail on some mammal, like maybe a raccoon or something that stretches out far. You get the middle of the body, and it's maybe not very far to the tip of the nose, but then it's a lot farther to the end of the tail. So you got more of a stretch like that. Or it could be like maybe the Nike symbol where it stretches out more on one side than the other. So that'd be something like that. So symmetrical like a bell. If it's right skewed, skewed, then the right side goes out further than the left. Kind of like some animals you might think. Or again, left skewed, the left side would go out further than the right side does. Okay, so this was right skewed, and so in other words, more than 8 months. Okay, so quote, the distribution of variation had to be right skewed, I reasoned. After all, the left of the distribution contains an irrevocable lower boundary of 0, since mesothelioma can only be identified at death or before. Thus, there isn't much room for the distribution's lower or left half. It must be scrunched up between 0 and 8 months. But the upper or right half can extend out for years and years, even if nobody ultimately survives. The distribution must be right skewed, and I needed to know how long the extended tail ran. For I had already concluded that my favorable profile made me a good candidate for that part of the curve. The distribution was indeed strongly right skewed, with a long tail, however small, that extended for several years above the 8-month median. I saw no reason why I shouldn't be in that small tail, and I breathed a very long sigh of relief. My technical knowledge had helped. I had read the graph correctly. I had asked the right question and found the answers. I had obtained, in all probability, the most precious of all possible gifts in the circumstances, substantial time. I didn't have to stop and immediately follow Isaiah's injunction to Hezekiah, set thine house in order, for thou shalt die and not live. I would have time to think, to plan, and to fight. One final point about statistical distributions. They apply only to a prescribed set of circumstances. In this case, to survival with mesothelioma under conventional modes of treatment. If circumstances change, the distribution may alter, unquote. And that would mean the median and the variation. So if things changed, instead of an 8-month median, maybe it could be 12 months or 6 months. And then instead of people, if things were really weird, instead of people living a few years, mostly after the 8 months, maybe they would only live 3 months. So something like that. So it's contextual. What are the causes of this stuff affect the distribution? Again, it's not an abstraction that makes reality conform in a Platonic sense. The variation isn't there for the distribution. That's just an abstraction. The distribution is an abstract way of describing the variation, the concrete things. And so when there's a change in the causal relationships in the concrete things, what they eat, what they know, what they can do medically or scientifically, then that'll change the distribution. Okay. Just like, here's a simple example. People take the SAT. If they take it again, they'll get 50 points above or below that on average. But that's all things being equal. So if one takes the SAT and then delves into studying the different subjects, some math, some algebra 1, algebra 2, geometry, sentence diagramming, grammar, reading, learns content and techniques, things are no longer the same. It's a different distribution. They will not be limited by that 50 above or below. Things are not the same. They can increase their score a lot. Or, I need to get the link on this, get a reference, but in one thing I was reading, maybe it's in John Rady's book Spark, or it was in maybe something I was reading about sleep, maybe a book by Matt Walker, or Secrets of Sleep by Heller. One school changes start time for teenagers to be later, and I think their SAT score, average SAT score, went up like 100 to 150 points just because the students were getting more sleep and could remember better, were more creative, were learning better, things like that. So there, things are no longer equal. It's a different distribution. And I wrote the school, but they never wrote back during them. I wanted to see more detail about that, 1 to 150, like how it affected the middle, the upper part, the lower, things like that. Wanted to see if I can get detail, but they were nice enough to not write back. But, so I'll read this again. Quote, one final point about statistical distributions. They apply only to a prescribed set of circumstances. In this case, to survival with mesothelioma under conventional modes of treatment, unquote, and conventional ideas about diet, nutrition, and stuff. Quote, if circumstances change, the distribution may alter. I was placed on an experimental protocol of treatment and, if fortune holds, will be in the first cohort of a new distribution with a high median and a right tail extending to death by natural causes at advanced old age, unquote, which seems like he might have had. But different cancer, not so much natural causes, but more old. Okay, quote, it has become, in my view, a bit too trendy to regard the acceptance of death as something tantamount to intrinsic dignity. Of course, I agree with the preacher of Ecclesiastes that there is a time to love and a time to die. And when my skein runs out, I hope to face the end calmly and in my own way. For most situations, however, I prefer the more martial view that death is the ultimate enemy, and if I find nothing reproachable in those who rage mightily against the dying of the light. I read that a little bit wrong. For most situations, however, I prefer the Marshall view that death is the ultimate enemy, and I find nothing reproachable in those who rage mightily against the dying of the light. The swords of battle are numerous, and none more effective than humor. My death was announced at a meeting of my colleagues in Scotland, and I almost experienced the delicious pleasure of reading my obituary penned by one of my best friends. The so-and-so got suspicious and checked. He, too, is a statistician, and didn't expect to find me so far out on the right tail. Still, the incident provided my first good laugh after the diagnosis. Just think, I almost got to repeat Mark Twain's most famous line of all, "The reports of my death are greatly exaggerated," unquote. All right. Awesome, beautiful, excellent, deep article I love to share. So much to dig into and analyze and think about. Analysis, synthesis, some philosophy, connecting statistics to philosophy, to life, to reasoning, to logic, to epistemology, to science. Very good. And a key thing here I want to, point out is the proper relationships of concepts to reality. That's what's central here and behind this. Plato made the mistake not knowing better, but unfortunately it's had tragic consequences in our world. Frustration, injury, death, destruction. Plato thought that concepts were the real thing, and the concrete individual was less real. And that goes back to, for example, in astronomy, there was the idea of, quote unquote, saving the appearances. Like in this one article from some resource I'll have to look up. I have something good about saving the appearances I'll put in the notes if I find. But here in this one article, I can give you an idea about it anyway, so you can get more an idea about Plato. It says, so in this article, they're talking about Plato and a philosopher Simplicius, not the one in Galileo's dialogues, but supposedly some ancient Greek philosopher. And this is from, I think, a book by Duham, To Save the Phenomena, book or article. I'll have to look it up. So, quote, Plato lays down the principle that the heavenly body's motion is circular, uniform, and constantly regular. Unquote. So, some Greeks and others thought that the sun went around the earth in a circle. The moon went around the earth in a circle. All the planets and stars went in circular motion around the earth at the center. Okay, so Plato lays down the principle that the heavenly body's motion is circular, uniform, and constantly regular. Thereupon, he sets the mathematicians the following problem. What circular motions, uniform and perfectly regular, are to be admitted as hypotheses so that it might be possible to save the appearances presented by the planets? Continuing, Simplicius explained, the curious problem of astronomers is the following. First, they provide themselves with certain hypotheses. Starting from such hypotheses, astronomers then try to show that all the heavenly bodies have a circular and uniform motion, that the irregularities which become manifest when we observe these bodies, they're now faster, they're now slower, they're moving now forward, now backward, their latitude now southern, now northern, their various stops in one region of the sky, they're at one time seemingly greater, at another time seemingly smaller diameter, that all these things and all these things analogous are but appearances and not realities, unquote. All right, there is another example, another context for how to think about Plato and what he's saying and how it's such a failure. In other words, they make crap up and then try to justify it with the world. And if the world doesn't fit it, if the things are concrete, it doesn't fit your perfect ideas, then the appearance is unreal. What you perceive, the real concrete things, they're not important. It's the abstract ideas that are important. And that's screwy. So, and Plato would believe that if you dig a little deeper, that the evidence of the senses and experience was misleading and full of error. It would lead you astray. It was full of illusion. It could not be trusted. And those who relied on it were therefore full of illusion and mistakes and lies. And they had to be governed by those who were separate from the evidence of the senses, in other words, from reality, those who made crap up and were lost in La La Land. But with the perfect ideas, the forms. So there's a little bit more about what Stephen Jay Gould was talking about with the Platonic heritage. And, as you can see, it had to be put aside, and some people didn't agree. Thankfully, they followed Aristotle. Aristotle was the first one to start developing this, a genius. Aristotle, student of the philosopher Plato, but a student who separated from Plato's academy. Aristotle made his own and did things right. Plato was a genius, but was wrong on most everything. Aristotle was a genius, but got a lot of stuff right. Especially, and most importantly, some fundamentals. So here's a quote from an article about Aristotle by the physicist, PhD at the University of Virginia, Dr. Michael Fowler. I'll put a link to some of this, as I say in the notes. You can look over, refer to it, read it more. So, quote, to summarize, Aristotle's philosophy laid out an approach to the investigation of all natural phenomena to determine form by detailed systematic work, unquote, detailed work, variation, concrete things, not by, as Plato did, making crap up and trying to see if the world fit it, and then dismissing some of the discrepancies by saying the world's not good enough. No, Aristotle looks at details, variation, concrete things, as Stephen Jay Gould did. And where does it come from? Where did Gould get it? Aristotle was a philosophic father. So again, quote, to summarize, Aristotle's philosophy laid out an approach to the investigation of all natural phenomena to determine a form by detailed, systematic work, and thus to arrive at final causes. His logical method of argument gave a framework for putting knowledge together and deducing new results. He created what amounted to a fully-fledged professional scientific enterprise on a scale comparable to a modern university science department. It must be admitted that some of his work, unfortunately, some of the physics, was not up to his usual high standards. He evidently found falling stones a lot less interesting than living creatures. Unquote. Okay, so Aristotle was more interested in biology. I'll put some links to some stuff about that too, so you can see how he was praised for his incredible work, for what he did at the time. Aristotle was more interested in biology and philosophy. Okay. Quote, yet the sheer scale of his enterprise, unmatched in antiquity and for centuries to come, gave an authority to all his writings. It is perhaps worth reiterating the difference between Plato and Aristotle, who agreed with each other that the world is a product of rational design, that the philosopher investigates the form and the universal, and that the only true knowledge is that which is irrefutable. The essential difference between them was that Plato felt mathematical reasoning could arrive at the truth with little outside help. But Aristotle believed detailed empirical investigations of nature were essential if progress was to be made in understanding the natural world. Unquote. Read it again and remember it in context of what Gould said about regarding means and medians is the hard reality. That's the Platonic heritage, whereas it's the variation that's real. That's the hard reality. So, quote, the essential difference between them was that Plato felt mathematical reasoning could arrive at the truth with little outside help. But Aristotle believed detailed empirical investigations of nature were essential if progress was to be made in understanding the natural world, unquote. And that's true. It is known explicitly. It was explicitly taken up by Galileo. So here's some things there. In the book Galileo Galilei, When the World Stood Still, by Atlanès writes, quote, Galileo's radical renewal sprang, nevertheless, from the Aristotelian mindset, as it was taught at the Jesuits' Collegio Romano. Human reason has a basic ability to recognize and understand the objects registered by these senses. The objects are real. They have properties that can be perceived and then further processed according to logical rules. These logical concepts are also real, if not in exactly the same way as the physical objects, unquote. Concrete things, variation, first. Abstractions, means, medians. Distributions of things, statistical distributions like graphs and shapes. Secondary, abstract, less real. Right there. And from Galileo himself. So, by the way, first, the radical renewal was a radical, that means fundamental, at root, revolutionary. A renewal, a fundamental, at root development of how science should be done. It sprang from the Aristotelian mindset. Okay, and here Galileo is responding to some scholastics. Scholastics were some philosophers in the Middle Ages who blindly followed Aristotle and were Christian. They didn't understand Aristotle, but they would memorize it and blindly follow it. And if something was written in Aristotle, not methodological, but some stuff written there they believe just because it's written by authority. They didn't grasp the epistemology of Aristotle and think for themselves. So Galileo did, though. It's known, and Dr. James Lennox in a prior podcast episode discusses this, that Galileo taught Aristotle's logic at university. It's documented. So he was familiar with Aristotle's logical writings. So, quote, I should even think that in making the celestial material alterable, I contradict the doctrine of Aristotle much less than do those people who still want to keep the sky inalterable. For I am sure that he never took its inalterability to be as certain as the fact that all human reasoning must be placed second to direct experience, unquote. There, in his own words. That's from something I read in a book, Discoveries and Opinions of Galileo. It's things Galileo wrote. It's translated by Stillman Drake. And this is from the second letter of Galileo Galilei to Mark Welser. It's about sunspots. But again, so people used to think that things in the heavens were unchanging, inalterable. Stuff on earth changed. People looked up in the sky, the same thing, like same dots of light for thousands of years in the same place. Very little change. Things on earth, people would be born and die, and there'd be floods, and some stuff would crumble and fall and get worn away and stuff. So on Earth, there was a lot of change. In the heavens, no change. But Galileo's saying, well, Galileo recognized with his investigations using his telescope that there was change in the heavens. There was alteration, there was change. And so he says, quote, I should think that in making the celestial material alterable, unquote. Aristotle, as Dr. Michael Fowler's pointed out, wasn't interested in falling rocks and some astronomy. So I'm not sure how much, I don't know if anybody knows how much work he did there on his own versus how much he was going with what the current doctrine was at the time, probably the latter. But so in his writings, in ancient Greeks, they thought things in the heavens were not changing. And Galileo's speaking against that, saying it's wrong. So these scholastics don't agree because it says in Aristotle right here, we're following authority, that's what it says. So Galileo's contradicting Aristotle, they're blindly following him. But he's pointing out that he's disagreeing with Aristotle less than they are. He's pointing out they actually disagree with him more because it's a fundamental in Aristotelian thought that all reasoning is placed second to direct experience. That is much more important and broad, underlies many more things, connects many more things than does the things in the heavens not being changeable. So he's more consistent and more Aristotelian than they are. He knows it, and does agree. So there's that view of concepts. Concepts come from the world and are integrations of them. They're not some separate thing as Plato thought. Plato, the Platonic heritage is concepts are some separate thing. They're not. They're mentally processed individual things, processed to make some new unit of thought, like dog or cat or bacon. And Newton's in here too with rejecting Plato. Newton explicitly in his 4 rules of reasoning, he's like Galileo, he's Aristotelian, he sticks to the concrete things, he doesn't just make stuff up. Remember the way Ptolemy and the Platonists did things from this other article, to go back and quote, quote, the curious problems of astronomers is the following. First, they provide themselves with certain hypotheses, unquote. They just make something up. Like Plato says, it's got to be circular and uniform. Well, why? Just because it's got to be. Well, why? Because it's got to be. Quote, starting from such hypotheses, astronomers then try to show that all the heavenly bodies have a circular and uniform motion, that the irregularities which become manifest when we observe these bodies, that all these things and all those things analogous are but appearances and not realities, unquote. So that's not how science works. Galileo and Newton explicitly rejected that. Like here, Rule 4, Newton. He calls physics experimental philosophy. That's what the words at the time, how things were. Now we call it physics, but by experimental philosophy he means physics, of course. But quote, Rule 4. In experimental philosophy, we are to look upon propositions inferred by general induction from phenomena as accurately or very nearly true, notwithstanding any contrary hypotheses that may be imagined. till such time as other phenomena occur, by which they may either be made more accurate or liable to exceptions. Unquote. So, making stuff up is not scientific, notwithstanding any contrary hypotheses which may be imagined. You can't just imagine something, make something up, be Platonic. It's irrelevant. That's not scientific. Science is induction from concrete things, from the variation. And here, the 4 rules. Quote, Rule 1, we are to admit no more causes of natural things than such as are both true and sufficient to explain their appearances. Rule 2, therefore to the same natural effects, we must, as far as possible, assign the same causes. Rule 3, the qualities of bodies which admit neither intensification nor remission of degrees, and which are found to belong to all bodies within the reach of our experiments, are to be esteemed the universal qualities of all bodies whatsoever. Unquote. So, there is some development of what Stephen Jay Gould was talking about with the Platonic versus the Aristotelian, with regarding the concrete as real. And you see, that's what's allowed us to have proper modern science develop, which was developed by Galileo and Newton and some others, rejecting the Platonic heritage, engaging in a radical renewal, a fundamental at-root rejection of Platonism by going to the epistemology. That's what we need to do in statistics, in science, in education. This thing here that Galileo says should be a principle of all science. And just because you think it's science, it's not. When you dig into it, there's a lot of, Plato unfortunately influences some modern so-called scientists, and some other bad philosophers do. Not enough modern scientists are Aristotelian through and through, and with a good understanding for it. But as Galileo said, this principle should be the case in physics, in education, in statistics, and so on. Quote, all human reasoning must be placed second to direct experience, unquote. And that's like an idea Stephen Jay Gould is working on too, and that the Wright brothers did. To fly a plane, direct experience comes first, not some authority. For the Wright brothers, to live long, it's not what someone claimed, but what is experience, what is the hard realities. So this, as Gould says, yes, it is not some dry, irrelevant matter. This is fundamental, life-giving, deep, important as he says, let me scroll up here. Like, for example, quote, if a little learning could ever be a dangerous thing, I had encountered a classic example. Unquote. Right. His knowledge matters. Or here, when he said, quote, knowledge is indeed power, in Bacon's proverb. And he had the right mindset and ideas about what to do. So these are some things that should come up in teaching statistics and math to show it matters. Interpret it correctly, teach some epistemology, teach some logic, teach some thinking skills, which is ultimately the point of education. Education is not some game students play for a while while they're growing up until they become adults, something to keep them occupied and distracted. education should be about, and proper real education is about, training students for adult life. Everything should be done in that service. Why do we teach algebra? No one cares. It's not for the sake of algebra. It's to prepare a student for adult life. Why do you teach grammar? To prepare a student for adult life, to help them be human, to bring out their humanity, to help them be good rational animals. Same thing here. That's what should happen. And this article really gives good examples of how to think about statistics, how to think about math, how to think about science. It's got abstractions that apply to how to think about education, how to think about thinking. How should we present statistics? How should we think about it? How should we think about science? And then, oh man, there's just a plethora of connections here between, this multidisciplinary stuff, interdisciplinary stuff, connections between different subjects. So this should be read by students, read by teachers. It's got a very good, logical, proper, rational presentation of how to think and conceive of and teach and learn and do statistics. So, rubbing my eyes here, a little late, tired. So, and then we got the development of this into science, connecting this with Galileo, history, Newton, experimentation, taking us into the modern world. A lot we could do with this. So, hope we get that article, read it more, read it every now and then through the years, think about it, dig into these other things we've discussed, look at the links, follow it more, really improve our understanding of what statistics and math and science and conceptual knowledge is, so we can live better, teach better, better schools, better teaching. Students can do a better job, live better lives. That's the ultimate thing this is about. Let's keep the end goal in mind, please. Not get lost in the trees. Let's not lose sight of the forest because we're hyper-focused on some tree or something. Let's not isolate. Let's integrate and connect. So, hope you found that interesting. I sure did. I love that article. It is passionate and rational. It is, as like the old band Rush would say, heart and mind united in a single perfect sphere. It shows the eminent practicality of reasoning and thinking and science and knowing how to do things right and interpret statistics right with the correct philosophic perspective. Great. So I hope you got that. I hope you like that. I hope you got a lot out of it. And I hope you share this with others. Make the most of it. Live a good human life.